Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. Tonight isn't about some dusty medieval ritual or a scandal from Versailles. No, this one's modern, raw, and it never stopped haunting the headlines. We're talking about Madeleine McCann, the case that refused to die. 18 years on, the main suspect walks free. The parents still search, the police still juggle files, and the media, louder than ever. And here's the deal. We're not just dipping a toe into the rumors, we're going full circle, a 360-degree dive. The night in Praia da Luz, the bungled investigations, the theories, the suspect, the rumors marked allegedly, and the brand new twist from September 2025. Every piece, every failure, every open wound. So get comfortable. And while you do, hit that subscribe, drop a like if you're into the darker kind of bedtime story, and tell me in the comments, do you believe Christian Brückner is guilty, or will this case remain an unsolved ghost forever? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring True Crime for Sleep. Madeleine McCann. Aftermath of a never-ending case. Let's begin. It was supposed to be one of those golden evenings you only get on holiday. The air in Praia da Luz was still warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and violet, and the kind of calm that makes you think nothing bad could ever happen. Families wandered along the promenade, children clutched ice creams that dripped onto their tiny hands, and somewhere in a small apartment complex just a short walk from the beach, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was being tucked into bed. Her parents, Kate and Jerry, were on holiday with friends. A group trip, relaxed and casual. They had developed a system, one of those clever little compromises parents invent. The children would sleep in the apartments, while the adults had dinner at a nearby tapas bar. Not far away, just across the pool. You could see the apartments from the restaurant terrace. Every half hour, one of them would get up, stroll back, check in. Efficient. Safe. Or at least that's how it seemed. Except safety, as it turned out, was more fragile than anyone imagined. Sometime between 9 and 10 p.m. on the 3rd of May, 2007, Madeleine disappeared, vanished from her bed, leaving behind nothing but a chaotic mess of questions that still echo today. No screams, no broken glass, no sign of struggle. Her younger siblings remained untouched, sleeping peacefully in their cots. Whoever entered that room took only her. Now, let's pause here, because what happened in the hours immediately after her disappearance is the kind of police blunder you'd expect from a badly written crime drama, not a real investigation. The so-called golden hours, those crucial first moments where evidence is fresh and suspects are close, were squandered. Instead of securing the apartment, Portuguese police allowed friends, family, even resort staff to walk in and out. Up to 20 people, by some counts, wandered through the small space where Madeleine had last been seen. Imagine the forensic nightmare. Fingerprints overlapped, footprints blurred, DNA traces smeared beyond recognition. It wasn't just the apartment either. Roads weren't sealed off, border checkpoints weren't alerted quickly enough. In the first 24 hours, any potential trail leading out of Praia da Luz could have been covered in tire tracks, drowned in noise, or simply lost in the wind. And then came the eyewitnesses. Oh, the eyewitnesses. Some swore they saw a man carrying a child in pajamas through the streets that night. Others remembered nothing unusual. A few accounts contradicted each other so badly, it was as if they were describing different towns altogether. One couple reported a suspicious figure near the apartment around 9:15. Another insisted the sighting was closer to 10. The details never quite aligned. The parents themselves were in shock, but shock quickly turned into suspicion, not of an intruder, but of them. Why did they leave the children alone? Why was there no forced entry? Why did Kate, on returning to the apartment, run back screaming that they've taken her? Not simply that Madeleine was missing. That one phrase would be dissected by tabloids, police, and armchair detectives for years. But in that first night, none of the speculation mattered. What mattered was a little girl was gone, and the people responsible for finding her were failing in real time. Dogs weren't brought in until much later. The crime scene tape went up after the damage was already done. And while officers asked questions and scribbled down notes, the McCanns were thrust under a spotlight brighter than anything they'd ever imagined. Praia da Luz itself seemed to hold its breath. A sleepy tourist town, suddenly crawling with journalists and detectives, locals whispering in cafes, tourists unsure if they should pack up and leave. Parents clutched their children a little tighter at night, because if a child could vanish from a holiday bed, what did that mean for anyone else's safety? Looking back now, this night marks the point where everything went wrong. Not just because Madeleine disappeared, but because the response collapsed before it even started. Those hours could have been the key to finding her, to catching someone red-handed. Instead, they became a black hole of uncertainty, the beginning of a case that would never end. And as we close the chapter on that first night, we step into the days that followed. When the case stopped being a family's personal tragedy and transformed into a global media storm. A storm that would define the McCanns, divide public opinion, and turn Praia da Luz from a quiet seaside resort into the epicenter of one of the most infamous disappearances in modern history. If you ever needed proof that tragedy sells, the days after Madeleine's disappearance were Exhibit A. Praia da Luz went from sleepy seaside town to full-blown media circus, faster than you could say, breaking news. Satellite trucks clogged the narrow streets, reporters swarmed cafes, and suddenly every corner of the Algarve was treated like ground zero for a global scandal. The McCanns, who had lost a child in the most nightmarish way imaginable, found themselves shoved in front of cameras before the shock had even settled. One day you're a family on holiday, the next you're leading nightly press briefings like reluctant politicians. And the press? Oh, they lapped it up. Every tear, every phrase, every slight twitch of body language was dissected. Because in the 24-hour news cycle, it's not enough to report. You need angles, suspicion, drama, preferably with ominous background music. And suspicion came fast. Some journalists whispered, no, shouted, that the parents seemed too composed, too rehearsed. Kate didn't cry enough on camera. Jerry sounded too clinical in interviews. Because of course the public knows the correct, universally accepted way to grieve, messy, hysterical, and preferably in HD. Anything else is suspect. Within weeks, the narrative split. On one side, grieving parents fighting to find their daughter. On the other, a potential cover-up, masterminded by two doctors who supposedly knew how to fool investigators. Tabloids ran with both versions, sometimes in the same issue. Heartbroken parents beg for help. On page 1, are the McCanns guilty? Tucked neatly inside. Balanced journalism, right? The Portuguese police didn't exactly calm the waters. Their leaks to the press blurred fact and speculation beyond recognition. One day it was DNA traces in the hire car. The next it was cadaver dogs allegedly signaling in the apartment. Never mind that lab results were inconclusive or later dismissed. Once the story hit the front page, It became gospel for millions. Meanwhile, self-proclaimed experts popped up like mushrooms after rain. Psychics offered visions of where Madeleine might be. Body language specialists appeared on talk shows to analyze every blink and sigh. Internet forums blossomed with theories, some so elaborate they read like rejected Dan Brown plots. There were maps, timelines, arrows, and lots of red string. Everyone had the answer, except the people actually in charge of the investigation. And then came the money. Donations flooded in because people wanted to help, and also because people love to feel like part of a tragedy. The McCanns set up a fund, which became both lifeline and lightning rod. Every pound donated was later scrutinised. Did they use it for private investigators, legal fees, family expenses? In the public eye, grief has to be audited. The circus reached its absurd peak when paparazzi began following not just the McCanns, but their friends, neighbours, anyone even remotely connected. Some reporters allegedly tried to bribe locals for gossip. Others recycled rumours as exclusive insights. By summer, Praia da Luz had become less a crime scene than a stage, with the McCanns unwillingly cast as leading actors in a grim soap opera. Of course, the irony here is brutal. The same media frenzy that kept Madeleine's face on front pages worldwide also poisoned the investigation. Genuine leads drowned in a sea of sensationalism. Every shaky witness statement became breaking news. Every rumour spread faster than fact-checkers could blink. And through it all, the one person missing from the entire performance was Madeleine herself. Looking back, you wonder if the case could ever have survived that level of attention. The media spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it distorts. It takes shadows and turns them into monsters, takes uncertainties and spins them into absolutes. In May 2007, the McCanns needed clarity. Instead, they got a storm. And as the headlines screamed louder, the police work grew quieter, sometimes sloppy, sometimes contradictory. Which brings us to the next act. How suspicion slowly, inexorably shifted from strangers in the night to the parents themselves. If true crime has taught us anything, it's this. When a child goes missing, suspicion doesn't start with strangers, it starts at home. And so, inevitably, the bright, merciless spotlight that had already turned the McCanns into unwilling celebrities now twisted into something darker. Why? Because grief never seems to look right on camera. Kate was accused of being too cold. Jerry of being too rational. As if losing your child came with a script, a manual on how many tears per hour count as authentic. She didn't collapse dramatically enough, some tabloids hinted. He spoke like a doctor, not a grieving father, others sneered. Apparently, if you can form a sentence while your world implodes, you must be hiding something. Then there was the apartment itself. No forced entry, no smashed window, just an unlocked door and a child gone. Easy fuel for suspicion. Add in the infamous phrase Kate reportedly shouted, "They've taken her!" And suddenly, armchair detectives across the globe had their smoking gun. Too specific, they said. Too rehearsed. Because clearly, a panicked mother should have said something vague like, "Oh dear, a child-shaped absence," instead. Portuguese investigators, already stung by criticism over their early blunders, found an easier target than faceless predators. The parents. By naming Kate and Jerry as official suspects, arguidos, they shifted the narrative. From a bungled search for a missing child to a potential domestic cover-up. For the tabloids, this was like Christmas come early. And the evidence? Flimsy at best. Cadaver dogs alerted in the apartment and near the family's rental car. DNA samples taken from the vehicle supposedly matched Madeleine. Strong leads scream the headlines. Except, when tested in UK labs, those same samples were deemed inconclusive. The DNA could have belonged to half the McCann family. But that didn't make for great clickbait. So the nuance was conveniently ignored. Meanwhile, the fund that had been set up to search for Madeleine became another weapon. Were the McCanns using it properly? Did they spend it on lawyers rather than private eyes? Did they, shock horror, pay the mortgage? The public wanted heroes, not humans, and any sign of imperfection was quickly labelled as guilt. In cafes from Lisbon to London, people debated the case as if it were a soap opera cliffhanger. I don't know, they seem off, one would say, sipping coffee. Parents don't just leave kids alone like that. Never mind that plenty of parents did. It's just that their children didn't disappear under the glare of international headlines. The irony, of course, is that while suspicion swirled around the McCanns, actual investigative momentum was slowing to a crawl. Resources went into proving or disproving the parents' involvement instead of chasing down other leads. Every day spent chasing the theory of a cover-up was a day not spent following the possibility of abduction. Eventually the tide shifted again. British authorities threw their weight behind the McCanns, essentially declaring them innocent of wrongdoing. Portuguese prosecutors dropped the arguido status, but the damage was already done. Public opinion had been poisoned. Even now, almost 2 decades later, you can still find people on internet forums claiming the parents were responsible. That's the thing about suspicion. It's sticky. Once attached, it never quite washes off, no matter how many official statements clear your name. For Kate and Jerry, it meant living not only with the trauma of a missing child, but also with the endless echo of, maybe it was you. And so, by the end of 2007, the case had become less about finding Madeleine and more about feeding a global obsession. The parents were still under scrutiny, the investigation still a mess, and yet somehow the story was only getting bigger. Because when national pride gets bruised, political pressure builds, and millions of pounds of taxpayer money enter the scene, you get something new. An international task force. Which brings us to the next chapter, where the British police step in with their very own plan to solve the unsolvable. Spoiler. It didn't exactly go as advertised. When politicians panic, they don't call therapists. They call Scotland Yard. And so, in 2011, 4 years after Madeleine McCann vanished, the British government decided enough was enough. The Portuguese police were stuck, the tabloids were restless, and public sympathy was starting to curdle into anger. Time for London to roll out the big guns and show the continent how it's done. The operation even got a name, because every good mystery needs branding. Operation Grange. It sounded serious, efficient, like men in sharp suit with laser pointers and crime scene models. In reality, it was dozens of detectives parachuted into a case already contaminated by 4 years of chaos. A bit like joining a poker game where half the cards are missing and the other half are covered in coffee stains. At first, there was optimism. Prime Minister David Cameron himself backed the review, with millions of pounds in funding. It was marketed as a fresh set of eyes. Investigators pored over Portuguese case files, set up charts, built databases, tracked down long-forgotten witnesses. There were briefings full of confident language, significant progress, new lines of inquiry, a dedicated team, the kind of buzzwords designed to keep taxpayers nodding politely while their wallets opened. For the media, it was a gift. The story was back in the spotlight, polished with the credibility of Scotland Yard. Reporters could write headlines like "New Hope for Madeleine" and recycle the same stock photos without guilt. Every anniversary brought promises of breakthroughs just around the corner. Every lull in the case could be filled with speculation about what Operation Grange might discover next. But here's the rub. All the money in the world can't unsmear fingerprints or rerun botched DNA tests. Evidence lost in 2007 was still lost in 2011. Witness memories didn't magically sharpen after 4 years. If anything, they grew fuzzier. Some had moved, others had died, and a few had started to believe their own embellished stories. The investigators were essentially trying to build a puzzle where the key pieces had been vacuumed up long ago. Still, Operation Grange churned on. For a while, the task force ballooned into one of the most expensive cold case reviews in British history. Dozens of detectives whittled down the suspect list, then whittled it again, until they claimed to be focusing on a small number of critical leads. Translation: the haystack is smaller, but the needle is still missing. Behind the scenes, there was friction. The Portuguese police didn't appreciate being treated like amateurs, and the British detectives didn't exactly hide their disdain. Add to that the occasional German prosecutor barging into the conversation with bold claims of their own, and the case began to resemble a dysfunctional family reunion. Everyone talking over each other, nobody actually finding the missing child. By 2015, the optimism was gone. The team shrank, budgets were trimmed, and press statements grew noticeably vaguer. What began with big promises of resolution had devolved into bureaucratic maintenance. Keep the lights on, shuffle the papers, and reassure the public that all options remain open, which, in police speak, means don't hold your breath. The irony is hard to miss. Operation Grange didn't solve the case, but it did keep the case alive. It kept Madeleine's name in the headlines, justified continued funding, and ensured politicians could point to ongoing efforts. In other words, less a breakthrough, more a life support machine. And yet, even in this limbo, the operation laid the groundwork for what came next. Because while the British were bogged down in bureaucracy, another country was preparing to take the stage. A country less concerned with polite press conferences and more willing to point a finger. Which brings us inevitably to Germany, and to a man whose name would soon become synonymous with this endless nightmare. If you thought one police force bungling a case was bad, try 3 at once. That's the Madeleine McCann investigation in a nutshell. Portugal, the UK, and Germany all circling the same mystery, each convinced they're the ones who'll finally crack it, and each quietly rolling their eyes at the others. Let's start with Portugal, the scene of the crime. To locals, this was their case, their embarrassment, their responsibility. From the very beginning, the Polícia Judiciária bore the brunt of international ridicule for failing to secure the crime scene and losing vital evidence. And if there's one thing national police forces hate more than unsolved crimes, it's being told by outsiders that they've screwed up. So, when Scotland Yard arrived years later with their fresh eyes and big budget, Portugal reacted with the enthusiasm of a cat being forced into a bath. Cooperation? Yes, officially. But in practice, often minimal, sometimes begrudging, and occasionally passive-aggressive. Then came the British. Operation Grange was meant to be the cavalry, polished detectives riding in to restore order. But to many in Portugal, it looked like colonial arrogance, London swooping in to fix what the locals couldn't. And the Brits didn't help their own cause by leaking confident sound bites to the press. Every announcement of new leads was essentially a diplomatic slap in the face. because nothing says partnership like implying your counterpart is incompetent. And finally, Germany. They weren't even directly invited to the party at first, but once Christian Brückner's name surfaced, German prosecutors stormed in like they owned the place. They didn't just say they had a suspect, they practically declared the case closed. "We are convinced Madeleine is dead," they told the world in 2020, with the kind of bluntness that made both the British and Portuguese squirm. Prosecutors don't usually talk like that unless they're ready to drop a mountain of evidence. Except, in this case, the mountain turned out to be more like a molehill. What followed was less a joint investigation and more a three-way tug-of-war. Britain wanted to prove their expensive task force wasn't a waste of taxpayer money. Portugal wanted to protect what remained of their reputation. And Germany wanted to be the hero who finally delivered justice. The result? Endless meetings, endless press releases, and a lot of finger-pointing. The irony here is delicious. The very thing that was supposed to help, international cooperation, ended up slowing everything down. Evidence sharing was clunky, legal standards didn't align, and egos got in the way. A statement admissible in one country might be worthless in another. A search warrant valid in Portugal wouldn't necessarily hold in Germany. The result was a bureaucratic traffic jam, with Madeleine's case stuck somewhere in the middle, honking for attention. Meanwhile, the McCanns had to stand by and watch as three nations bickered over who was doing the better job of not finding their daughter. Every anniversary brought fresh headlines from a different capital. UK police pursue new suspects. German prosecutors certain of Brückner's guilt. Portuguese investigators insist theories are flawed. It was less a coordinated effort and more like three competing trailers for a film that never got made. And through all this, the clock kept ticking. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and the evidence that might once have tipped the scales continued to rot away. The tragedy of the case wasn't just that a little girl vanished. It was that the people tasked with finding her were too busy protecting their own pride to ever truly work as one. But as dysfunctional as it all was, one name eventually managed to cut through the noise, rising above the national squabbles and bureaucratic inertia. A name that turned the investigation on its head and shifted the entire narrative from mystery to manhunt. That name was Christian Brückner, and his arrival in the story would change everything. Or at least, make it look like change was finally coming. Every true crime saga needs its villain. And in 2020, after 13 years of fog, whispers, and dead-end leads, the world finally got one. Christian Brückner. A man whose resume reads like a greatest hits compilation of all the things you'd rather your neighbor didn't be doing. Born in Würzburg, Germany in 1976, he didn't exactly glide through life as a model citizen. By his teens, he was already dabbling in petty crime. Because why waste time with school when you can practice breaking into holiday homes? He bounced between foster care, youth detention, and petty thefts. If the justice system had a loyalty card, Brückner would have collected enough points for a free espresso machine. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd graduated to heavier material, drug dealing, burglary, and later sexual offences. In the late 1990s, he landed in Portugal, drawn by the sun, the sea, and, allegedly, the thriving underworld of expats who found the Algarve an ideal base for both leisure and shady side hustles. He lived out of caravans, squats, and occasionally houses he borrowed without asking permission. If you picture a man living off-grid with a rotating cast of girlfriends, a stash of dodgy videos, and a knack for staying one step ahead of landlords and police, you're not far off. But Brückner wasn't just your average lowlife. He had range. One moment he was stealing diesel from trucks, the next he was dealing hashish, and later he was allegedly filming himself abusing children. A Renaissance criminal, if you will. His rap sheet was so long that German journalists eventually stopped listing all his offences because the articles were getting too bloated. And yet, despite the pile of convictions, he somehow kept slipping through the cracks. In 2005, he brutally raped a 72-year-old American woman in her holiday home in Praia da Luz, the same town where Madeleine would disappear 2 years later. He tied her up, beat her, filmed the attack. The crime was monstrous, and yet it took over a decade for him to be convicted. Why? Because evidence languished in storage, bureaucracies shrugged, and witnesses weren't chased with urgency. Justice, in his case, moved slower than dial-up internet. Meanwhile, Brückner played the role of drifter. Friends, if you can call them that, later described him as manipulative, violent, and obsessed with young girls. One acquaintance recalled him making disturbing comments about abducting children. Another mentioned his endless collection of porn, some of it illegal. Police reportedly seized hard drives buried near a deserted factory containing videos of assaults. Allegedly, of course, because nothing in this case ever comes without the word alleged stapled on top. By the mid-2000s, he was drifting around the Algarve in a camper van. Witnesses would later place him near Praia da Luz, around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. His phone pinged on a mast close to the McCann's apartment that very evening. A coincidence? Maybe. The kind of coincidence detectives love to circle in red pen, though. The irony, naturally, is that despite all of this, he wasn't charged in connection with Madeleine. Not then, not later. German prosecutors announced in 2020 that they were convinced he had killed her, but their so-called evidence was thin. A handful of circumstantial details, an alleged jailhouse, confession, and a suspect whose lifestyle certainly looked guilty enough. But as any lawyer will remind you, looking guilty and being proven guilty are two very different things. The media, however, didn't care about the legal fine print. They finally had a face to plaster across front pages. Brückner became the monster, the predator, the prime suspect. His scruffy mugshot and rusty camper van were splashed everywhere, turning him into the bogeyman of the case. Parents could point at his photo and tell their kids, "That's why you don't talk to strangers." And here's the kicker. Brückner himself denies everything. Every connection to Madeleine, every whispered rumour. He sits in interviews insisting it's all a witch hunt. That he's being scapegoated because the world desperately needs someone to blame. And in a twisted way, he's not entirely wrong. The investigation, starved of hard evidence and desperate for resolution, latched onto him like a lifeline. Was it justice closing in, or just desperation dressing itself up as certainty? So, we end up with this paradox. A man with a horrific past, guilty of unspeakable crimes, who just happens to have been in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place, depending on your perspective. Everything about him screams, likely suspect. And yet, in the cold light of court, the evidence against him still wobbles like a cheap folding chair. And that's the tragedy within the tragedy. When your prime suspect is a man so obviously rotten, the bar for proof somehow rises even higher. Everyone thinks it must be him. But until someone produces the missing piece, the undeniable court-proof evidence, Christian Brückner remains what he's always been. A drifter, a criminal, a predator, and an alleged killer walking just outside the reach of justice. And as his name echoed across headlines in 2020, the world braced for the case to finally break open. But instead of closure, we got another twist, one that would take years to play out and culminate not in a courtroom, but in a September morning in 2025, when prison gates in Germany swung open. On paper, it all lined up neatly enough. Christian Brückner, convicted rapist, drifter, creep with a taste for children, living in Praia da Luz at the exact time Madeleine vanished. Add a rusty camper van, a suspicious phone call, and a reputation darker than a Portuguese espresso, and you've got yourself the perfect suspect. Case closed, right? If only reality worked that way. The first smoking gun, and let's be honest, it was more of a cap gun, came in the form of phone records. Investigators discovered that Brückner's mobile had pinged a cell tower near the McCann's apartment on the night of the 3rd of May, 2007. Not just anywhere in Portugal, right there, in Praia da Luz. Coincidence? The prosecution called it damning. The defense called it irrelevant because half the Algarve was probably using that tower at the time. And unfortunately for detectives, the defense wasn't wrong. A masked ping is the kind of evidence that sounds exciting on TV, but in court it's about as persuasive as saying, he was within a 5-kilometer radius of the crime scene. Congratulations. So were thousands of other people. Then there was the camper van. A battered, yellow and white Volkswagen Westphalia. The sort of vehicle that makes neighbours automatically suspicious even when it's just parked outside a supermarket. Witnesses later recalled seeing a similar van near the resort. Some swore it looked identical. Others weren't so sure. Either way, the van was gone by the time anyone thought to look inside it, leaving detectives with nothing but grainy photos and a sense of if only. And of course, there were the rumours of confessions. A former acquaintance claimed Brückner once bragged about knowing what had happened to Madeleine. A cellmate allegedly heard him describe abducting a child, allegedly being the operative word, because jailhouse confessions have about the same reliability as gossip overheard in a pub toilet. Inmates lie, embellish, or repeat what they read in newspapers, and courts know it. Then came the digital trail. Police uncovered hard drives filled with disturbing material linked to Brückner, allegedly hidden near an abandoned factory. The content was vile enough to secure convictions in other cases. But here's the catch. None of it directly tied to Madeleine. Horrific? Yes. Legally relevant to this case? Debatable. You can be guilty of 1,000 crimes and still not be guilty of the one everyone cares about. Investigators also leaned on witness testimony. A friend reported that Brückner had once fantasized about abducting children. Another remembered him ranting about the McCanns, calling them stupid for leaving their kids alone. Disturbing, sure. But was it evidence? Not exactly. More like the kind of detail that fuels documentaries and tabloid headlines, rather than airtight indictments. And so, we ended up with a mountain of suspicion and a molehill of proof. Enough to convince the public, enough to justify dramatic press conferences, but not enough to convince a judge. German prosecutors went as far as announcing in 2020 that they were certain Brückner had killed Madeleine. Bold words. The kind of words that make you think they've got something huge tucked away. A silver bullet waiting to be fired. And yet, years passed. No charges, no trial, no bullet. The contradictions piled up. Some witnesses placed Brückner near the scene, others swore he wasn't. The camper van might have been his, or maybe not. The phone ping was incriminating, unless you considered how many other people used that same tower. The alleged confessions might have been chilling admissions or just attention-seeking lies. It was, in essence, the worst kind of case, one that looked airtight from a distance but dissolved into mist the closer you got. From the outside, Brückner seemed like the answer to 18 years of questions. But inside the walls of a courtroom, seems like doesn't cut it. The law demands more than suspicion, more than pattern matching, more than vibes. And vibes were really all anyone had. The irony, of course, is that Brückner's history made him an investigator's dream suspect. He ticked every box: violent, opportunistic, nearby, creepy as hell. He was practically born to be cast as the villain in this story. But when the world is already convinced you're guilty, the bar for evidence rises even higher. Because what if everyone's wrong? What if this time the monster isn't the right one? And so, the case staggered on, year after year, press conference after press conference, hint after hint of an imminent breakthrough. Madeleine's face reappeared in headlines. Brückner's mugshot became the new icon of suspicion. But justice? That stayed out of reach, which left the world with a question it still hasn't answered. When you have the perfect suspect but no proof, what do you actually have? Hope? Closure? Or just another chapter in a story that refuses to end? And that question, simmering for years, would only grow louder as time went on. Because eventually suspicion alone wasn't enough to keep the narrative alive. The world wanted action, conviction, justice. And instead, in September 2025, it got the exact opposite. A prison door swinging open, and the prime suspect walking free. Justice is supposed to live in courtrooms, but in the Madeleine McCann case, justice took an early detour and moved straight into the headlines. Long before a judge ever saw the name Christian Brückner on a docket, the public had already tried, convicted, and sentenced him, in absentia, armed with nothing but suspicion and clickbait. When German prosecutors stood in front of cameras in 2020 and declared they were convinced Brückner had killed Madeleine, it was a gift-wrapped present for the media. Not "we suspect," not "we are investigating," but convinced. A word heavy enough to imply certainty, but vague enough to dodge accountability. Perfect fuel for the machine. Overnight, Brückner became the monster of Praia da Luz, the bogeyman who had finally been given a name. The tabloids went to town. Front pages plastered his face, often the least flattering mugshot available, paired with phrases like prime suspect and evil predator. His camper van, now a character in its own right, was photographed from every conceivable angle. Headlines screamed certainty, even though the evidence behind the curtain was still murky at best. For the public, this was closure by proxy. After years of confusion and shifting theories, they finally had someone to hate. Forums lit up with declarations of guilt. Talk shows invited body language experts to analyze footage of Brückner walking into court for unrelated charges. Every scratch of his nose was dissected. Every smirk interpreted as proof. It was less criminal investigation and more reality TV, complete with a villain edit. And yet, the irony was glaring. While prosecutors expressed conviction, they never actually filed charges in connection with Madeleine. For years, nothing moved. The certainty expressed in press conferences didn't translate into courtroom evidence. It was all suspicion wrapped in official language, which the media then repackaged as fact. Police convinced suspect killed Maddie, screamed headlines, conveniently leaving out the part where conviction in a newspaper isn't the same as conviction in court. Meanwhile, the McCanns were caught in the middle of this trial by media. On one hand, they finally had an official suspect who wasn't them. a shift they must have welcomed after years of insinuation. On the other, they had to sit through wave after wave of speculation, promises of breakthroughs, and inevitable letdowns when those breakthroughs never came. Imagine clinging to every headline, only to find the substance dissolving like sugar in tea. The public, of course, didn't care about nuance. They rarely do. For them, the narrative was simple. Brückner is guilty. End of story. And if you dared point out the lack of proof, you risked being labelled naive or disrespectful to the McCanns. Doubt was framed as disloyalty. The case wasn't just about evidence anymore, it was about belief. This transformation from investigation to belief system turned Madeleine's disappearance into something more than a crime story. It became a cultural touchstone, a mirror for how society consumes tragedy. Every anniversary was treated like a ritual, every scrap of new information a holy relic. Brückner, conveniently, played the role of the devil. And while the public handed down its guilty verdict, Brückner himself played the part of the defiant outsider. Through lawyers, he denied involvement, mocked the accusations, and insisted he was being scapegoated. Witch hunt became his favorite term. The irony? He wasn't entirely wrong. The absence of hard evidence did make the case look like a witch hunt, albeit one where the witch was, by any standard, a deeply unpleasant man you wouldn't want within a mile of your children. The public's guilty verdict created a strange paradox. On the one hand, pressure mounted on prosecutors to finally deliver charges. On the other, the higher the expectation, the bigger the risk of collapse if those charges couldn't hold up. It was like building a skyscraper on sand. Impressive to look at, but dangerously unstable. Years passed in this limbo. Each time the prosecutors hinted at progress, the press announced the case was practically solved. Each time nothing materialized, disappointment set in, quickly recycled into fresh outrage. And through it all, the one undeniable fact remained unchanged. Madeleine was still missing. The court of public opinion is fast, brutal, and unforgiving. But unlike real courts, it doesn't deliver justice. It delivers noise. And in this case, the noise was deafening. Which brings us to the cruel irony of the story. While the world shouted guilty from the rooftops, the actual justice system was preparing to do something entirely different. Not convict, not sentence, but release. Because by September 2025, the man widely assumed to be Madeleine's killer wasn't heading into a cell. He was walking out of one. Christian Brückner did end up in court, just not for the crime everyone cared about. The irony is almost cinematic. The man publicly branded as the monster who stole Madeleine McCann was sentenced instead for another atrocity, one so horrific, it makes you wonder how he wasn't locked away decades earlier. In 2005, 2 years before Madeleine vanished, a 72-year-old American woman was attacked in a holiday home in Praia da Luz. Brückner broke in, tied her up, raped her, filmed the assault, and left her traumatized in ways words can't capture. The brutality was beyond doubt. The evidence existed. But thanks to the usual bureaucratic sleepwalking, it took more than a decade for the case to reach trial. By the time justice finally arrived, Madeleine had already been gone for years, and Brückner had managed to live as a free man, moving between Germany and Portugal like a ghost. When the German court eventually convicted him, the press pounced. Headlines practically fused the two crimes together. Madeleine suspect jailed for rape. Never mind that the conviction had nothing to do with Madeleine. For the media, it was close enough. Why spoil a good narrative with legal precision? And yet, the symbolism was hard to ignore. Here was a man who had lived in the same town, who had committed monstrous acts, who clearly had the capacity for violence. It didn't take much imagination to draw a line from the 2005 rape to the 2007 disappearance. Imagination, after all, is the media's favourite substitute for evidence. The courtroom itself was a study in contrasts. On paper, it was about a single victim, a single crime. But in the audience, in the coverage, in the whispers outside the courthouse, it was about Madeleine. Every guilty verdict, every detail of Brückner's cruelty was absorbed into the larger mythos. He wasn't just being punished for what he did in 2005. He was, in the eyes of the public, paying for 2007 as well. But here's the problem. Justice doesn't work that way. You can't convict someone for one crime and pretend it answers another. A guilty verdict for rape doesn't magically transform into a guilty verdict for abduction and murder. For prosecutors, it bought time. For the McCanns, it may have offered the faint comfort of knowing the suspect wasn't free to wander. For the tabloids, it was another banner headline. But for Madeleine's case, nothing moved. No new trial, no new evidence, no closure. And this is where the tragedy of bureaucracy comes into sharp relief. The German system had Brückner in their grip, but only on unrelated charges. They couldn't stretch that conviction to cover Madeleine. They couldn't legally argue, well, he's clearly a bad man, so he must be guilty of everything else. That might fly on internet forums, but not in a courtroom. So the years tick by. Brückner sat behind bars, not as the man who killed Madeleine, but as the man who raped a pensioner. It wasn't justice for one of the most famous missing children in the world. It was justice of a narrower, colder sort. And the longer it dragged on, the more unbearable the irony became. Because eventually, sentences end. Even for monsters. And when that day comes, the paperwork doesn't ask whether you're suspected of unsolved crimes. It simply checks if you've served your time, which meant that sooner or later, the gates would open, and the man still whispered about as Madeleine's killer would step out, free, or at least as free as someone can be with an ankle tag and a spotlight following him everywhere. That moment finally arrived in September 2025. And it's here that the story swerved once again, from courtroom certainty back into the maddening realm of uncertainty. The release of Christian Brückner wasn't just a legal formality, it was a narrative earthquake. Because if the supposed monster walks free, what does that say about the case? About justice? About the possibility of ever knowing what really happened that night in Praia da Luz? It was the kind of morning that should have been forgettable. Grey sky, drizzle on concrete, journalists yawning into takeaway coffees outside a German prison gate. But on the 12th of September 2025, those gates creaked open, and out walked the man who had been branded, dissected, and vilified as the prime suspect in one of the most infamous cases of the century. Christian Brückner, free. Well, free is relative. Technically, he had served his sentence. Technically, the justice system had done its job. But in the court of public opinion, he wasn't stepping into freedom. He was stepping into infamy. Every camera clicked, every headline was pre-written. Maddie suspect released. Not convicted rapist released. Not ex-prisoner starts probation. Always Maddie suspect. His name is welded to hers, forever, no matter how many courts fail to prove the connection. He left prison with the kind of awkward shuffle you only see in men who know they'll never blend into normal life again. Some reports claimed he muttered a denial under his breath. Others said he smirked at the cameras. Either way, his image was instantly splashed worldwide. For the press, it was Christmas in September. Shots of the prison gate opening ran on loop, each broadcaster dressing it up with ominous commentary. And the outrage came fast. Politicians scrambled for statements, some insisting his release was a disgrace, others retreating into the usual, "We must respect the rule of law." Tabloids didn't bother with nuance. "Monster walks free," screamed one front page. Social media melted down. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Maddie, hashtag Brückner, hashtag never forget. And under every post, the same chorus: "How can this man be free?" The irony is brutal. The same system that had dragged its feet for decades, that had botched investigations, that had leaked speculation like a sieve, was now suddenly airtight when it came to rules about sentencing. No special extensions, no bending the law to appease headlines. The paperwork was in order, the time was served, the gates opened. End of story. Except, of course, it wasn't the end of anything. For the McCanns, it was a gut punch. Imagine 18 years of waiting, watching, hoping, and now being told that the man you've been assured is the key suspect is no longer behind bars. For the police, it was humiliation wrapped in bureaucracy. For the media, it was a renaissance, a brand new chapter in a case that refuses to die. And for Brückner himself, freedom came with a spotlight so bright, it could fry skin. Surveillance followed him, neighbors whispered, and reporters camped outside whatever safe house or shabby flat he tried to call home. He wasn't walking back into anonymity. He was walking into a new kind of prison, one with no bars but infinite scrutiny. The release also reopened every conspiracy theory like a wound. If Brückner was truly guilty, why hadn't they nailed him? If he wasn't, why had prosecutors spent years parading him as the villain? Was he a convenient scapegoat for three nations that had failed spectacularly to solve the case? Forums erupted, old blogs reignited, and YouTube filled with fresh explainer videos connecting dots that probably weren't dots at all. The McCanns, dignified as ever, released a statement. It was careful, measured, but heavy with subtext. They would keep fighting. They would not give up. They still believed their daughter could be found, or at least the truth about what happened. Reading between the lines, it was also a quiet indictment of the authorities, because how could a system declare a man guilty in spirit but never prove it in court, then simply let him walk away? And so, the Freilassung became more than just a bureaucratic inevitability. It was the perfect metaphor for the entire Madeleine McCann case. Justice almost, but never quite. Suspicion, but not certainty. Outrage, but no resolution. As the cameras followed Brückner into his new half-life, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't closure. This was the case rebooting itself. A fresh wave of headlines, a new surge of speculation, and the same unanswered question echoing louder than ever. If the prime suspect walks free, what now? If the investigation was a mess, the rumour mill was a masterpiece, because while police forces stumbled over paperwork, the public was busy doing what the public does best, filling in the blanks with whatever made the most sense. Or more often, whatever made the most drama. Let's start with the classics. Theory number 1. A stranger broke in and took Madeleine. Clean, simple, cinematic. The kind of plotline Netflix loves because you can package it into 8 episodes and call it The Night in Praia da Luz. This theory is still the official favourite, the one police cling to, the one parents can live with. But it's also the one most vulnerable to cliché. No broken windows, no forced entry, no sign of struggle. So the narrative relies heavily on the idea that criminals in the Algarve are basically ghosts who can glide through unlocked doors and vanish without a trace. Then we get to theory number 2. The parents did it. Brutal, cold, and endlessly popular in internet forums. The supposed motive? Accidental overdose, maybe sedatives to help the children sleep, followed by a panicked cover-up, allegedly. It's the kind of theory that refuses to die because it scratches a particular itch. The suspicion that people who look too perfect must be hiding something. And the McCanns, with their calm demeanour and middle-class doctor credentials, became easy targets. Tabloids milked this line for years, mixing selective evidence with generous dollops of innuendo. It didn't matter that courts and prosecutors cleared them. Once the rumour was out there, it became immortal. Next on the list, organised crime. Some say Madeleine was snatched by a child trafficking ring operating across Europe. A chilling idea, with just enough real-world precedent to make it plausible. Certain witnesses reported suspicious men hanging around the resort that week. Others spoke of vans, coded phone calls, or shady expats living off the grid. Again, allegedly. This theory adds an international conspiracy flavour. The kind of thing that makes documentaries salivate. Whether it's true or not hardly matters. It keeps the case alive, spinning in perpetual motion. And then, of course, we slide straight off the cliff into full-blown tinfoil hat territory. Some claimed Madeleine was kidnapped as part of an elite paedophile ring linked to politicians, celebrities, even royalty. The kind of fever dream where every famous handshake hides a secret society. Internet forums stitch together flight records, photographs, and the occasional pizza menu, presenting evidence with all the confidence of seasoned detectives. Allegedly, of course, though let's be honest, it's less investigation and more group therapy for people who spend too much time online. A personal favourite among the fringe theories that Madeleine never disappeared at all, that she was whisked away by her own parents to live under a new identity. The supposed motive shifts depending on who's talking. Insurance scam, custody drama, or simply because they wanted a fresh start. The fact that this makes absolutely no sense hasn't stopped it from bouncing around message boards for nearly 2 decades. Conspiracy theories don't need logic. They just need vibes. And then there are the psychics. Oh yes, the psychics. Every high-profile disappearance attracts them like moths to a flame. Seers from across the globe claimed visions of Madeleine. In Morocco, in Malta, in the mountains of Spain. Some described her standing by a river, others saw her in a basement. A few even phoned the family directly with urgent revelations. Not one of these visions has ever panned out. But that doesn't stop them resurfacing every few years, just in time for another anniversary headline. The irony in all of this? These theories, however wild, have kept the case alive more effectively than any official investigation. Every rumour is oxygen. Every half-baked theory keeps Madeleine's name circulating, keeps the clicks flowing, keeps the story immortal. Without the conspiracy crowd, the case might have faded years ago. Instead, it thrives in that strange twilight zone where tragedy meets entertainment. But there's a darker side too. Every new theory drags the McCanns back into the spotlight, forcing them to relive their trauma in public. Every allegation, no matter how absurd, sticks like mud. Once you've been accused of killing your own child, the stain never fully washes out. And that's the cruelty of rumour. It doesn't have to be true to ruin lives. So here we are, 18 years later, with more theories than facts, more whispers than evidence. And the cruel truth is that rumours are addictive. They offer certainty where there is none, answers where official investigations have failed. They give people the illusion of control, a way to make sense of the senseless. But they also drown out the silence. The silence of not knowing. The silence of a little girl still missing. The silence that police, prosecutors, and journalists have never been able to break. And now, with Brückner out of prison, those rumours aren't fading. They're multiplying. Because if the alleged villain walks free, maybe the story isn't over. Maybe the conspiracy theorists were right all along. Or maybe, just maybe, the truth is still buried somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Though probably not by a man on YouTube with a red string corkboard. If you thought the media would eventually tire the Madeleine McCann case, you haven't been paying attention. The press doesn't let go of a story like this. It feeds on it. Madeleine isn't just a missing child. She's become a genre, a renewable energy source for headlines, documentaries, and late-night debates. Every anniversary, every rumor, every hiccup in the investigation is turned into content. The cycle is predictable, almost ritualistic. In late April, just before the anniversary of her disappearance, the headlines begin to warm up. New leads in the McCann case. Detectives re-examine evidence. Key suspect under pressure. Usually these stories are recycled from old reports, lightly dusted with speculation, but they don't need to be new. They just need to remind the public that the case still exists. By early May, the media frenzy is at full pitch, complete with somber anniversary specials and exclusive interviews that reveal nothing exclusive at all. Television has been especially shameless. There have been at least half a dozen documentaries, each promising to reveal the untold story. Netflix dropped The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann in 2019, stretching hours of footage and talking heads into a bingeable package. Tabloid-style docuseries aired in the UK, Portugal, Germany, each one recycling the same grainy holiday photos, the same reenactments of Kate walking into the apartment, the same experts rehearsing theories we've all heard 100 times. It's less investigation, more syndication. And then there are the papers. For British tabloids, Madeleine has been the goose that lays golden eggs. The Daily Mail, The Sun, The Mirror, they've all run thousands of stories. At one point, editors allegedly joked about how a Maddie splash could always boost sales. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Is this the breakthrough? New agony for parents? Suspect's shocking past. It's tragedy as tabloid theatre. The appetite never shrank because the story was endlessly adaptable. When suspicion focused on the McCanns, the press cast them as villains. When Operation Grange launched, they became the stoic heroes. When Brückner emerged, the spotlight shifted again, and he became the monster. The narrative changes, but the feeding frenzy never stops. Even now, in 2025, with Brückner's release, the machine is still grinding. Within hours, international outlets ran near identical headlines. Madeleine McCann, suspect, walks free. Television crews parked outside his supposed safe house. Drones allegedly buzzed overhead, trying to capture exclusive footage of a man eating toast in his kitchen. Because nothing screams justice like grainy paparazzi shots of a suspect buttering bread. And of course, social media has turbocharged everything. In the early years, forums and blogs were the main rumor mills. Now, it's TikTok detectives and YouTube theorists. Teens born after 2007 make earnest videos analyzing Brückner's mugshots or reenacting the timeline with dramatic music. Hashtags trend annually, spawning millions of views. The case has been transformed into a participatory mystery, where anyone with Wi-Fi can pretend to be Poirot. The irony? The media attention has both helped and hurt. Madeleine's face became one of the most recognized in the world. Tips poured in from every continent. But that same exposure also poisoned the investigation. Genuine leads drowned in noise. Innocent people were smeared as suspects. And the McCanns, who wanted awareness, not celebrity, found themselves trapped in a role they never asked for. For the press, though, it's perfect. Because the case is unsolvable and unending, it's also inexhaustible. There will never be a final headline, never be a last broadcast. Even Brückner's release wasn't closure, it was fuel. New specials, new interviews, new speculation. The media doesn't want an ending. Endings kill stories. What it wants is what it has. An eternal cycle of outrage, pity, suspicion, and hope. A narrative treadmill that can keep running long after everyone involved has aged, retired, or died. And so, Madeleine McCann remains less a person than a brand. A story that sells. A headline that always delivers. A ghost kept alive not by evidence, but by the hunger of a machine that never stops eating. But while the media feasts, the legal system remains an entirely different beast. Slower, drier, infinitely less cinematic. And it's there, in the quiet grind of bureaucracy, that the next chapter of this tragedy plays out. The courtroom battles that happen not over guilt or innocence, but over procedure, paperwork, and politics. In theory, justice is blind. In practice, justice is bureaucratic, painfully slow, and allergic to the kind of drama that sells newspapers. And nowhere is that contrast starker than in the Madeleine McCann case, where the justice system whispers in cautious legalese while the public screams for answers at full volume. For prosecutors, everything is about evidence, and not the juicy, circumstantial kind that makes headlines, but the kind that survives in court. DNA that isn't contaminated. Witnesses who don't contradict themselves. Confessions that aren't whispered in prison showers to cellmates looking for lighter sentences. The law doesn't deal in vibes. It doesn't care how creepy Christian Brückner looks in a photo, or how many times a cadaver dog barked near a hire car. It cares about proof, chain of custody, admissibility, dry, unforgiving proof. The public, of course, couldn't care less about admissibility. They see a rapist with a dodgy past who lived in Praia da Luz, and they think, case closed. Why is he still free? Why hasn't he been charged? What are the prosecutors waiting for? It's the kind of outrage that boils over on talk shows, Twitter threads, and pub conversations. Everyone wants justice, but they want it now. And they want it simple. The irony is brutal. The public's thirst for closure pushes prosecutors to speak with certainty even when they don't have it. Remember Germany's bold statement in 2020? We are convinced Madeleine is dead, and Brückner is responsible. Strong words, but legally toothless. They bought headlines. They soothed outrage, temporarily. But once the dust settled, people started asking the obvious question. If you're that convinced, where are the charges? Cue awkward silence. Meanwhile, judges and lawyers play by rules that make sense in court but look absurd in public. Technicalities matter. Deadlines matter. A piece of evidence mishandled 18 years ago can't simply be fixed for trial. Witnesses who misremember details don't get a do-over. Justice might crawl forward, but once it stumbles, it rarely gets back up. The public sees this as failure. The justice system sees it as integrity. Better to let a guilty man walk than to convict without proof, lawyers say, quoting centuries-old principles. It's noble in theory, infuriating in practice. Try telling a family who's waited 18 years for answers that the burden of proof is just too high. Try explaining to the millions convinced of Brückner's guilt that their certainty doesn't equal evidence. It's like explaining fine print to a mob with torches. And yet, the justice system can't bend just to soothe public outrage. If it does, it risks collapsing under its own contradictions. Convict Brückner, without airtight evidence, and every appeal court in Europe will shred the verdict, fail to convict him, and the headlines scream failure anyway. It's a lose-lose game played in the harshest spotlight imaginable. What makes it worse is that the system isn't one system. It's three. Portuguese, British, German. Each with its own rules, egos, and politics. Each blaming the others when things stall. Each leaking half-truths to the press to prove they're doing something. Meanwhile, the actual progress? Measured in millimeters. For the McCanns, this disconnect is torture. They are forced to live in both worlds at once. The courtroom world of delays and silence, and the public world of noise and outrage. One tells them to be patient. The other tells them they've already waited too long. One shrugs and says, insufficient evidence. The other screams, the monster walks free. Neither world delivers what they need. Truth. And so, the paradox remains. Justice plods on, bound by rules, allergic to shortcuts. The public rages, fueled by headlines and heartbreak. Both sides demand different things, and in the middle sits the case itself, unsolved, unclosed, and endlessly spinning. It's this tension between slow law and fast outrage that keeps the case alive. If the system moved faster, maybe the noise would fade. If the public calmed down, maybe prosecutors would work in peace, but neither will change. And that means the Madeleine McCann case isn't just about a missing girl anymore. It's about a system and a society staring each other down, both refusing to blink. And as the legal stalemate dragged on, another force began shaping the narrative. Not courts, not cops, not even parents, but the online world, with its TikToks, hashtags, and viral theories. Because in the digital age, justice isn't just blind, it's trending. If the press made Madeleine McCann into a story, the internet turned her into a franchise. What began in 2007 as whispers on message boards has mutated into a full-blown digital industry. Hashtags, podcasts, TikTok investigations, and YouTube documentaries churned out with the regularity of seasonal pumpkin spice lattes. The case predates social media as we know it, but it adapted beautifully to the online age. Back in the late 2000s, it lived on forums. People with too much time and too little evidence connecting dots in sprawling threads that read like amateur detective novels. By the 2010s, YouTube channels were breathlessly rehashing the timeline, often with eerie background music and a red string aesthetic borrowed straight from crime dramas. And now, in the 2020s, the case has been fully TikTokified. Scroll your feed and you'll find 19-year-olds, born after Madeleine vanished, explaining the case with all the gravitas of seasoned detectives. They use dramatic pauses, throw in words like chilling and shocking, and overlay grainy images with ominous music. Some rack up millions of views in hours. Comments flood in. Justice for Maddie. The parents are Suze. OMG, this gave me chills. Welcome to the new Agora, where tragedy is content and clicks are currency. Podcasts, too, have feasted. True crime has become the Spotify generation's comfort food, and the McCann case is always on the menu. Entire series are dedicated to exploring the mystery, padded out with speculation, interviews with experts, and the occasional dramatic reading of old witness statements. The irony? Most of these podcasts end exactly where they begin, with no answers. But the lack of resolution isn't a bug, it's a feature. An unsolved case keeps the episodes coming. Closure would kill the content. Reddit naturally has its own rabbit holes. Subreddits dissect every interview the McCanns have ever given. Freeze-framed screenshots of Kate's face mid-sentence are analysed as evidence of deception. Users proudly share 20-paragraph timelines proving, allegedly, that Brückner was framed, or that the Portuguese police buried the truth, or that Madeleine is secretly alive in Eastern Europe. None of it holds up in court, but online, it doesn't need to. Upvotes are the new verdicts. The obsession has even birthed a cottage industry of citizen detectives. People who book holidays to Praia da Luz just to retrace steps, photograph the ocean club, or interview bemused locals who have told their story 1,000 times. Some livestream their investigations, narrating in hushed tones as if they're uncovering sacred ground. What they usually uncover is a bar with cheap beer and locals sick of answering questions. And then there are the wild grifters, self-proclaimed psychics on Instagram selling readings about Madeleine's fate. YouTube channels promising exclusive leaks for Patreon subscribers. TikTok lives where people claim to have inside info from German police. It's tragedy as hustle. Tragedy monetized one click at a time. The irony is as sharp as ever. All this noise, all this obsession, and none of it brings us closer to the truth. In fact, it pushes the truth further away. Real tips drown in a sea of amateur theories. Serious investigators spend time debunking viral nonsense instead of chasing leads. And the McCanns, whose suffering is supposed to be the core of this story, are dragged through another cycle of scrutiny every time a teenager in Nebraska posts a video captioned, "The Maddie case explained in 60 seconds." But online, the obsession isn't about truth. It's about participation. People want to feel part of the hunt, part of the mystery. They want to belong to the story, even if that means inventing new plot lines. The McCann case has become a kind of digital campfire, where everyone gathers to share theories, swap rumours, and scare themselves with shadows. And as long as the internet exists, that campfire will never go out. Madeleine's face, her name, her story, they are permanently embedded in the online bloodstream. No algorithm will ever let them fade. Which brings us to the next uncomfortable question. If the online world has turned this case into an eternal obsession, what happens to the actual people still caught in its grip? The investigators, the neighbors, the suspects themselves? Because obsession doesn't just burn pixels, it burns lives. On paper, Praia da Luz should be paradise. Whitewashed villas, soft beaches, the Atlantic stretching out in postcard blues. It's the kind of place where families sip sangria while their children build sandcastles, where retirees stroll the promenade in floppy hats, where travel brochures promise peace. But mention the name anywhere outside Portugal, and nobody thinks of paradise. Praia da Luz is no longer a resort. It's a crime scene that never ends. Since May 2007, the town has lived under a shadow. For locals, it was like waking up one day and discovering your home had been branded in permanent ink. The Ocean Club, once just another family-friendly holiday complex, became the Ocean Club. Tourists still stay there, of course. Morbid curiosity has its own travel industry. But for the people who call Luz home, it's been 18 years of whispers, headlines, and cameras pointed at their front doors. Reporters descend every anniversary like migrating birds. They corner cafe owners, taxi drivers, anyone who ever knew anyone connected to the case. The same questions, year after year. What do you remember? Have you heard any rumours? Some locals stopped answering long ago. Others learned to charge for their stories. After all, if the world insists on treating your village as a set piece in a true crime drama, you might as well send an invoice. Tourists, meanwhile, come with a different hunger. Some genuinely don't realise what happened here. They sip cocktails on the beach, oblivious to the fact that half the locals roll their eyes whenever they unpack their umbrellas. Others come deliberately for the macabre thrill. They take selfies outside apartment 5A, post TikToks walking through the streets at night, whispering, "This is where it happened." Tragedy as holiday backdrop. Dark tourism at its most tasteless. The town itself has tried to move on, but how do you erase the world's memory? You can repaint buildings, rename businesses, plant more bougainvillea, but you can't stop people from Googling. Praia da Luz is forever entwined with Madeleine McCann. For the travel industry, it's a marketing nightmare. For crime junkies, it's a pilgrimage site. For the families who live there, it's just exhausting. And then there are the neighbours who really did live through it. The ones who saw the police swarm the Ocean Club. The ones who gave statements. The ones who were suspected of knowing more than they did. Some still insist the investigation was botched from the start, that local cops looked in the wrong places, ignored the wrong witnesses. Others just want the whole thing to disappear. But of course it won't. Lutz has become shorthand for one of the greatest unsolved cases of our time. That shadow doesn't lift. Even the physical landscape carries the weight. The narrow streets where journalists camped, the tapas bar where the parents ate dinner, the dusty hills where police searched with dogs and diggers. They're all burned into public imagination. When Netflix needs a drone shot, Lutz provides. When tabloids need a new search site, it's often the same old ground, photographed from a slightly different angle. The cruel irony, most residents weren't even directly touched by the case. Their lives were collateral damage, but they've been cast as unwilling extras in an 18-year drama they didn't audition for. And no matter how many years pass, the world only knows their town for one thing: a child who vanished and was never found. Praia da Luz is beautiful, yes, but in the global imagination, it will always be haunted. A paradise forever branded by absence. And as the shadows linger in that little town on the Algarve coast, the case stretches its reach far beyond borders. Because while Luz became the physical stage, the diplomatic and legal mess sprawled across 3 nations: Portugal, the UK, and Germany. 3 systems, 3 egos, 1 missing child. If you thought one justice system was messy, try 3. The Madeleine McCann case has been less an investigation and more a long-distance relationship gone wrong. Portugal, the UK, and Germany all involved, all suspicious of each other, and none willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, the whole thing was doomed from the start. Portugal had home advantage. The crime happened in Praia da Luz, on their soil, under their jurisdiction. But from the very beginning, they were cast as the bunglers. Critics pointed to missed opportunities, contaminated evidence, and the fact that investigators allegedly left the apartment unsecured on the very first night. Portuguese police bristled at the accusation. Understandably, nobody likes being told they screwed up while the whole world watches. But the damage was done. Their credibility never recovered, and every subsequent move was filtered through that lens. The cops who blew it? Enter the UK. Operation Grange, the grand British effort, was launched in 2011 with great fanfare and a budget that ballooned past £13 million. The promise: the best of Scotland Yard, sweeping in to bring order to chaos. The reality? Years of sifting through files, re-interviewing witnesses, and eventually circling back to the same handful of suspects Portugal had already looked at. The Portuguese called it arrogance. The Brits called it thoroughness. The tabloids called it hope. The taxpayers called it daylight robbery. And then, just when the case seemed to be collapsing under its own contradictions, Germany muscled in. By 2020, they had Christian Brückner in custody on unrelated charges and declared him their man. "We are convinced," prosecutors announced, pointing the finger with a confidence neither Portugal nor the UK had dared to show. But their boldness masked a different problem. They didn't actually have enough to charge him with Madeleine's disappearance, so they dangled certainty without delivering closure. The result? Headlines everywhere, and frustration multiplied by 3. The tug of war between these nations wasn't just about pride, it was about politics, funding, and face-saving. Portugal didn't want to be remembered as the country that botched the world's most famous missing child case. The UK didn't want to admit its £13 million investigation had achieved little beyond expensive holidays to the Algarve. Germany didn't want to back down after proclaiming Brückner guilty in spirit, if not in law. So each clung to their narrative, pointing fingers across borders, leaking tidbits to the press to make themselves look better. For the public, this looked like chaos. For the McCanns, it was agony. Imagine watching 3 entire legal systems argue over paperwork while your daughter remained missing. One prosecutor says they're convinced she's dead. Another insists there's still hope she's alive. A third shrugs and says nothing more can be done. How do you even process that? The irony is that international cooperation was supposed to be the strength of this case. Shared resources, shared intelligence, shared determination. Instead, it turned into a tug of war over narrative control. Each side desperate not to look like the weak link, each side leaking new leads whenever they needed to prove they were still relevant. And in the middle, the truth got lost. Evidence mishandled, files mistranslated, suspects questioned 3 times by 3 different systems. No single nation wanted to let go, but none could carry the weight alone. It was bureaucracy dressed up as justice, diplomacy dressed up as investigation. To this day, the tug of war hasn't ended. Portugal still insists their early theories weren't as wrong as portrayed. The UK still insists Operation Grange was money well spent, despite producing little more than reports. Germany still insists Brückner is guilty, even as he walks free. 3 nations, 3 stories, 1 missing girl. It's less a case file and more a diplomatic soap opera. And like all soap operas, it thrives on endless plot twists, cliffhangers, and unresolved tension. Closure would kill it. But the international stage wasn't just about law and politics. It was also about image, about how nations present themselves, how families are portrayed, how suspects are branded. And image, as the next chapter shows, is sometimes more powerful than truth. Freedom is a funny word. On paper, Christian Brückner walked out of prison in September 2025 a free man. He had served his sentence. The gates opened. Technically, that's what freedom looks like. But in reality, his new life is less about liberty and more about existing inside a glass box. Where do you go when you're the most infamous suspect in Europe? Not far. Reports claimed he was placed in a kind of supervised housing arrangement. Not prison, but not exactly a cozy flat share either. Think less Fresh Start and more Big Brother, except the cameras are real and the audience is everyone with a smartphone. Allegedly, police keep tabs on him constantly. Neighbours are tipped off. Journalists camp outside, drones buzz overhead, trying to capture shots of him walking his dog. Though whether Brückner even has a dog or just an ankle tag remains unclear. Every move he makes is a headline. If he goes shopping, someone snaps a photo. If he eats toast by the window, it's on page 3 by morning. Madeleine's suspect seen buying groceries. It's Kafka, rewritten as tabloid theatre. And the neighbours? Imagine learning the flat next door isn't occupied by a quiet student or a retired couple, but by a man the world has labelled child killer for 18 years. Whether or not the courts proved, it doesn't matter. In the eyes of the public, he's guilty. Parents cross the street, curtains twitch, local Facebook groups light up every time he's spotted. Allegedly, some landlords refuse to rent to him. Can't blame them. Christian Brückner slept here isn't exactly an Airbnb selling point. Ironically, he's more in prison now than he was behind bars. At least in prison, he had structure, anonymity among fellow criminals, the strange comfort of being just another inmate. On the outside, he's a pariah. Every walk down the street is a perp walk. Every glance over his shoulder a reminder that someone, somewhere, is watching. Lawyers say he insists on his innocence, that he mocks the accusations, frames himself as the victim of a witch hunt. And in a way, he's right. Suspicion has become his life sentence. But here's the bitter twist. Even if he is innocent, even if some long-buried evidence clears him tomorrow, the myth has already cemented. He will never be anything but the Maddie suspect. That label sticks harder than any legal verdict. So this is Brückner's freedom, living in a half-world between legal technicality and eternal suspicion. A man who can technically walk the streets, but does so with 1,000 invisible chains clinking at his ankles. He may never face a court for Madeleine McCann, but he's already been sentenced by the world. And the world is a harsher jailer than any prison could ever be. Which brings us finally to the bigger question. If the suspect is free, the case unsolved, and the parents still trapped in endless limbo, what now? So here we are. 18 years after a child vanished from a holiday apartment, the world still asks the same question it asked on that night in May 2007. What now? Christian Brückner is out of prison. Free, technically, though stalked by suspicion, journalists, and the ghosts of 1,000 headlines. The McCanns remain in limbo. Not grieving parents, not reunited parents, just suspended in a space where hope and despair circle endlessly. The police forces of 3 nations still shuffle paperwork, occasionally promising progress, but never delivering the one thing that matters. And the public? They've long since turned the case into cultural wallpaper, a mystery to binge, a story to speculate about, a brand to recycle. What now, indeed? In theory, the case is still open. German prosecutors say they haven't closed the file. British police still technically list Operation Grange as ongoing, though by now it's little more than a skeleton crew pushing pens around. Portuguese authorities continue to bristle at any suggestion they fumbled the ball. The machinery exists, but it feels like theatre. Endless announcements, no movement. Investigations without conclusions. The purest distillation of bureaucracy. For the McCanns, what now means more anniversaries, more statements, more polite interviews where they say the same words they've been saying for nearly 2 decades. We will never give up. We will keep searching. Madeleine will not be forgotten. Dignity is their armour. But behind it lies the same unbearable question. Can you ever move on when the world refuses to let you? For Brückner, What now is survival in a spotlight? Every trip to the shop, every photo snapped through a zoom lens, every whisper online is part of his new life sentence. If guilty, he's managed the unimaginable, escaping justice while still being punished by it. If innocent, he's the unluckiest man alive, forever shackled to a crime he didn't commit. Either way, his freedom is a mirage. For the media, what now? His business as usual. Next May, the cycle will restart. Retrospectives, new theories, blurry drone footage of Praia da Luz. Someone will promise a new lead. Someone else will leak a breakthrough. Nothing will change. But the clicks will keep flowing, the documentaries will keep streaming, and the myth will keep expanding. Madeleine, forever frozen at 3 years old, will continue to exist as a global symbol, not of childhood, but of unresolved tragedy. And for the rest of us, what now means sitting with the discomfort of a story without an ending. True crime has trained us to expect neat resolutions. A courtroom showdown, a shocking confession, a killer caught. This case denies us all of that. It resists closure. It refuses catharsis. It lingers, like an itch you can't scratch, a ghost you can't banish. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Madeleine McCann case. Not the suspects, not the theories, not even the evidence, but the emptiness. The refusal of reality to bend into a satisfying narrative. A story with no ending, no answers. Just an eternal question mark. So, what now? Now, we wait. Now, we speculate. Now, we live in the uncomfortable space between suspicion and certainty. Until something changes. If it ever does. Because this case isn't just a crime. It's a mirror. It shows us how justice fails, how media feeds, how the public obsesses, how grief endures. It shows us the stories we tell ourselves about evil, safety, and the illusion of control. And it shows us, most of all, that sometimes there is no resolution. Only aftermath. And that, sleepless rabble, is where we leave the case that refuses to end. No neat bow, no courtroom confession, no closing credits. Just echoes, speculation, and a world still asking, what now? If you made it all the way here, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe, drop a like, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next dive into history's unsolved ghosts. And tell me, in the comments, do you think Christian Brückner is guilty? Or is this one doomed to stay an eternal mystery? This has been Natmac Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Boring True Crime for Sleep, Madeleine McCann, Aftermath of a Never-Ending Case. Now, close your eyes, drift off, and let the noise fade, at least for tonight.